Ernesto Betancourt's keynote address. We're honored to have with us Professor Jorge Dominguez of Harvard University. He is Antonio Madero Professor of the Study of Mexico in the Department of Government, Vice Provost for International Affairs, the Office of the Provost, Senior Advisor for International Studies to the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and Chairman of the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies at Harvard University. He is, of course, one of our most famous professors in the Cuban diaspora. He's well known for having coined a number of important concepts relating to Cuba, in particular, proof moment. There are many others. And this is our proof moment, so.
Many thanks. I am delighted to be here, to see again many friends whom I've known for a long time. When I was preparing to come, I looked at my very long list of proceedings from this association, realizing that I have been connected to you also in that way for such a long time. I'm particularly thrilled that part of the activities for this event is to honor the work of these excellent students. I made sure to go to the student panel today, and the future study of Cuba is in excellent hands. These are really terrific presentations and work that promises a great deal. As I was also preparing for this session, I thought I should read up once again on some of the things that Ernesto Betancourt had written. I brought with me, sort of for comfort, what I think was his last book, Context for a Cuban Transition, published in 2004. And I decided to organize my remarks around the key themes of that book. So, to give my talk a title that Ernesto would have understood very well, it's Can Cuban Rulers Rule Cuba? That is an Ernesto Betancourt question. It's a question that he asked when Professor Batista was in power in the 1950s. It's a question he continued to ask throughout his life, including in this book. And I want to frame our remarks around it in the following sense. First, let me read you one sentence that combines both the insight, the thoughtfulness, often the cleverness, and the speculative side of Ernesto. Published in 2004, probably written in 2003, the cumulative impact of the events that he was summarizing has eroded Castro's charismatic hold over Cuba and divided the regime, making a Raúl succession less feasible. The first part I want to come back to because it includes a number of important elements that I will use to organize my own remarks. The point prediction, we all know, was incorrect. The point prediction is the least important part of this book. What I want to try to do is to flesh out the elements of an argument that is implicitly there. And just as I'm calling to your attention a phrase where Ernesto went wrong, I want to begin by saying that if Ernesto and I had been having a conversation in 2003, 2004, or an argument in 2003, 2004, I would have made an argument that would today, after you hear me, would have been wrong. I am about to argue that the Cuban political regime, the Cuban state, and the Cuban government, I'll tell you what I mean by those words as I go along, has weakened systematically over the past 20-odd years. This is not something that I would have expected. I did note and write about the early part of what I will summarize very briefly, but I had never expected that under a Raúl Castro presidency, the government would weaken. And by that I mean government officials who do not implement the decisions that have been made. That is relatively new. It is unexpected in a country whose slogan was, "For so long, Comandante en Jefe ordene." And it is one of the points that I want to develop, and of course that those are events after Ernesto wrote his book. The first couple of points that I want to make are points that I think for the most part are very familiar to you, so they deserve longer discussion. I will only touch on them because I want to focus on the Raúl Castro presidency. So the political regime, I think we all know, weakened around 1990 and in the early 1990s. It did so because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It did so because of the collapse of the internal economy. This group knows this. I'm not going to say anything else about it. I do want to say, however, two things about this weakening of the political regime. The political regime meaning the rules whereby there is a relation between the rulers and the ruled, which may be authoritarian, may be democratic, may vary over the world. With regard to these rules, the claim in Ernesto's quotation is that Cuba had witnessed a charismatic ruler, and he was saying that it was weakened. It is, from the perspective of 2012, easy to forget that Fidel Castro really did have a dramatic hold on a great many Cubans. And Ernesto, in his book, was using charismatic legitimacy in the way that I find most useful and important. It's not the characteristics of the individual. It's not how my blow-dried hair, if I had hair to blow-dry, would look like. That a charismatic leader is in some fundamental sense a construction of those who want to believe. Those who want to believe. That's where the word charisma has a religious origin. And Ernesto says, and I agree with him, that Fidel did have such a hold, and that hold cracked. When it cracked, you had two important processes that began. One was the rise of an organized and sustainable, and that second word is particularly important, sustainable political opposition. As Ernesto put it in his book, a dissidence that can be repressed but not finished. Or another way to make the same point, Cuba before, obviously, in the 1970s and 1980s, after the government had consolidated its power in the 1960s, Cuba in the 1970s and 80s had martyrs. People who would stand in the face of the power of the state and say, here I am, I can do no other. What it begins to have from the 1990s on is a set of individuals collectively organized, some of whom may die, as Osvaldo Payá just did, but who are replaced by those whose names we do not know today and who will organize in ways that we do not yet understand. That was the difference in the cracking of the political regime. Similarly, that is a time when a set of policies that had repressed all forms of organized religion start to be set aside, and there is a gradual decompression of state opposition over the Roman Catholic Church, but also over Afro-Cuban religiosity, varieties of forms of religious expression among evangelicals and the like, and some of that has picked up speed in the Raúl Castro presidency. In a society, it's important to remember that today, as before 1959, has been profoundly and deeply secular. Cuba is not Poland, and it never has been Poland. The other and last point I want to make about the change in the political regime is foregone opportunities. It would have been possible at that time to make a set of changes that did have to respond in a democratic direction. And the reason you would do that in a very limited and a very controlled way is to try to manage more effectively the politics of the regime. Fidel Castro and his associates chose not to use the instruments that were then and remain today at their disposal, and Raúl has not used them either. I'll give you just one example. The Cuban electoral law, not one that I recommend to any other country. The Cuban electoral law mandates multi-candidate municipal elections. This has been going on for a long time. These municipal candidates are vetted by a process that is highly controlled, but every municipal election, including the one that is taking place later this calendar year, is multi-candidate. The candidates cannot campaign. At the national level, the number of seats equals the number of candidates, and they can campaign. The government could have retained a single-party system with multi-candidate competition at both levels, and it could have allowed campaigning at both levels at once. It did not choose to do that. There is no sign that it wants to do that now, but it would be a way to open up to some extent the political regime to create a possibility of better management of public expectations. Just to make sure, these elections are not as silly as they seem. National Assembly election will take place in early 2013. 5 years before that, or 4.5 years ago from today, if you look at the results of the National Assembly election, where the number of candidates equals the number of seats, because Cubans vote in multi-district candidates. You have 2 candidates and 2 seats to be elected from the same district. The Communist Party's orientation, as it is called, is that you should vote for the united ticket. You should vote for everybody. And so you can look at the official results and look at 3 kinds of non-conforming behavior. Leave aside people who abstain, who stay home. It's very difficult to know why people do or do not stay home. Look at those who vote blank. Look at those who annul their ballots. You know, they write whatever it is they want to. And those who do not vote for the united select, who are breaking with the party's orientation. You sum those 3 categories in the last National Assembly election, 1.1 million Cubans cast a non-conforming vote. In an election where, with a single party in power, in an election where all the media, all forms of national communication are controlled from the top, in an election there was no competition, 1.1 million people nevertheless cast a non-conforming vote. These decisions do matter. Perhaps because they do matter, that's why the change has not been adopted. But it would have been, it still remains, an option, not likely. The effect of the changes that occurred, the effect of the foregone decisions is a weakening of the political regime. The weakening especially marked by greater freedom for people who choose to exercise their religious beliefs and for those who want to exercise political opposition. The state. By the state, I mean those who are exercising the legitimate monopoly of force. Cuba had been a law-abiding society. That law-abiding society came not just from the exercise of explicit coercion, some of it of course did, but it came mainly because citizens were law-abiding. Cuba was a very low-crime society. Even now, it remains a fairly low-crime society. It is after 1990 that illegal markets, which have of course existed in the past, boomed. And the rise of the illegal markets is a clear indicator of a much weaker state. The state that instead of engaging in enforcement must, because it is weaker, engage in forbearance. We simply cannot enforce the law. We will not enforce the law. And in some sense, we create the conditions that nurture illegality. Illegal markets can only function when some of those in authority, particularly police officers, but also in state security, local government officials, illegal markets can only function when those who have the authority to repress them tolerate them, accept them, and often promote them. That allowed capitalism of a sort to be reborn in crime. Note that for the first time we can begin to estimate the size of illegal markets. So among the self-employed, official Cuban government statistics tell us 2/3 had had no job before, nor were they pensioners in retirement. Much of what self-employment regulations do is to try to bring out those who have been in the illegal markets all along. In that sense, the main advocates of self-employment, of legalizing activities that have been illegal, one of the main arguments, one of the main proponents, main advocates, is the Ministry of the Interior. They have better things to do than chasing after people trying to sell bananas. Ernesto's argument on this point, I think, is important and should not be forgotten. His argument was that this compliance, that this law-abiding element, that this support for the rules of the state, because they were the laws of the land, came because there was a social fabric that supported existing institutions. This, he claimed, I believe correctly, also broke in the 1990s and in the early years of the 2000s. As Ernesto put it, the events that had taken place ended the egalitarian appeal. Egalitarianism was a very high value already in Cuba before the revolution. There's actually good historical work on that, but I don't have time to go into it. Egalitarianism surely blossomed in the 1960s, and it remained an important value, broadly shared and supported among Cubans. Whether you're reading poems, or whether you're trying to discern social science surveys, or whether you're reading the work of anthropologists, a high value for the decades that followed. Today, egalitarianism is seen in the documents of the Six-Party Congress of a little over a year ago as something you have to struggle against. Equality of opportunity is okay, says the Party Congress, echoing perhaps neoclassical economists. What is really not good is egalitarianism as an idea. The domestic critiques of many Cubans who in fact do support many, many changes, not only in economic policy but in other, is the loss of equality. That loss of equality, if you go back to Ernesto's important insight, includes a wide variety of elements. This loss of equality, the widening of inequality is a real, demonstrable, evident process. But one of the contributors, often unacknowledged, there's a panel tomorrow on tourism. One of the contributors to this phenomenon is beach tourism, because of the visibility of opulence of the tourists who come from Canada, from Western Europe, and elsewhere other than the United States. Because it also funds the inequality of those who work in the tourism sector, who are privileged workers allocated through a labor ministry mechanism that privileges those who are already in the Communist Party and in the Communist Youth Union. The effects of the visible opulence, the effect of the privileging of those who are already powerful, the widening of inequalities, tore the moral fabric of egalitarianism that had been an important underpinning of both the political regime and the state. Ernesto didn't make the point about beach tourism, but he did make the point about egalitarianism. Let's make sure that you understand what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am not saying that beach tourism promotes philosophical discussions while you are barely wearing any clothes. That's not the point. The point is that beach tourism is a dramatic external shock to the structure and the moral fabric of the regime, and the state weakened just as the regime had weakened. Note that the effects of the state to have its regulations obeyed, to have contracts fulfilled, remains a problem today as it's been over the history of the past half century. I was struck in the National Assembly that just met and adjourned. The government reported that 1/3 of all of the new cooperatives were already in violation of their contracts with national government agencies. It's not news, only that the example is new and recent. The regime has weakened, the state has weakened. The leadership has either deferred, or it's an example of foregoing opportunities to strengthen the regime. The most obvious opportunity to have strengthened the regime before would have been to emulate China and Vietnam. Unleash market forces, not because you're enamored of capitalism, but because you believe that the results will in the end, and for China it's been going on for a long time, and for Vietnam for a long time, strengthen the power of state and regime, make it possible for Cuban rulers to rule Cuba. Fidel was not interested in that solution, and he never adopted it. Raul Castro may be much more interested in that solution, but I am struck, and I want to give a couple of examples of the extraordinary ideological constraints that he has either continued to believe himself or has allowed to be persuaded by colleagues that should govern national policy. Take the manner in which self-employment has been authorized. Government could have said, we are deregulating a whole bunch of these relatively minor types of economic activities with the following 2 or 3 exceptions. And you know, as well as I do, that is not how it proceeded. There are, I think, 5 points that I want to call to your attention about the manner of deregulation that to me illustrate the difficulties in having this government be able to work effectively. First, that many of these activities are ever banned remains to me amazing. Who would care if a dandy is a government employee or a self-employed private person? Secondly, the micromanagement. By naming each of the activities, this band can play this type of music, but not that other type of music. You can be a repasador, but not a maestro. That kind of micromanagement is a state that believes it should not let go. Moreover, by choosing to proceed in this way, you are creating extraordinary uncertainty because you're signaling at one and the same time, not only that you can now engage in this activity, but that it can be taken away. Why would you invest in improving any number of these economic activities under those circumstances of uncertainty? The 4th point is that pretty much everything that now has been authorized had already existed illegally. And that's why I mentioned a moment ago, the Ministry of the Interior, State Security, was one of the principal advocates for economic liberalization. And the 5th element is that the way these decisions have been implemented, the manner of implementation, has widened inequality more. Again, I don't want to dwell too long on this. Second example I want to mention of this pervasiveness of ideology in impeding the government choosing the policies and implementing the policies that would serve its own interests best, China's strategy, the Vietnam strategy, is the December 2010 tax law. The tax law was just reviewed and revised in the National Assembly meeting, but this particular example that I am about to mention, I do not think was changed at the meeting that we attended. If you hire 6 employees as opposed to 5 or fewer, your tax bracket goes up. Note that this is not about taxing income, where your tax bracket may change. This is directly, this is not an argument that an economist might make about a variety of consequences of taxation of income. This is a direct tax on the generation of jobs. And the explicit rationale from the Ministry of Finance at the December 2010 National Assembly, when it was adopted, is to prevent the concentration of wealth and the exercise of economic power. This is, again, let me remind you, this is not about income. This is about economic power. This is about penalizing jobs. This is about preventing owners or small businesses from growing through additional employment. There is a significant debate in Cuba among government officials, among academics, both about the deregulation and self-employment rules and about tax policy. The same could be said about ideological constraints on new bank credit. The same could be said about the policies that allowed the use of state land, where one acquires use rights as opposed to full property rights, usufructo in Spanish. But those changes have not ended. The debate has favored those who prefer the ideological constraints. It is an important explanation for the limits of the changes that have been enacted. Why Cuban gross domestic product has grown so little, and there has basically been no attempt to generate new capabilities of power. Further example of weakening. Let me go on now to talk specifically, trying to watch the clock, the weakening of the government under Raúl Castro. Now I find it stunning. I really have difficulty on getting my hands around the fact that in 2008, when the agricultural laws are changed to authorize usufructo, to authorize someone to use state land or not to have full property rights. In 2008, there were 2.25 million hectares of idle land. For the most part, this is the legacy of the bankruptcy of the sugar industry and using the new state land to allow Marabu weeds to grow instead of using them for other productive purposes. 2.25 million hectares in 2008. At the end of 2011, more than 3 years later, still 1.25 million hectares were idle. This is a government that has too many officials who choose not to enforce the regulations they should be enforcing. Remember, on the Fidel, lots of bad rules were implemented, but they were implemented. The problem was not the lack of implementation. The problem was that those were bad policies. Usufructo, it's not something that I would have done, but usufructo is surely better than idle lands of Maraú. And it's not being implemented, and what you get is, to put it politely, bureaucratic procrastination. To put it perhaps more dramatically, it's the equivalent of a bureaucratic insurgency against the decision makers at the top of the government. And this theme of extraordinary frustration appears to anybody who looks through Raúl Castro's speeches, which are much easier to read because they're much shorter than his brothers. Take another example, perhaps more dramatic because it is public. Government employee dismissals. In the fall 2010, the government announced that it would dismiss 500,000 employees in the next 6 months. Procrastination, bureaucratic insurgency, choose your preferred word, but on the eve of the Party Congress, it was announced that no, Cuba really had not been able to dismiss 500,000 government employees, notwithstanding the very public announcement. In fact, once the full year had completed from the original announcement, in the 12-month period, Cuban government managed to dismiss only 127,000 government employees. To me, it's not just the failure of this other policy. It is that Raúl Castro on national television personally took responsibility and announced the failure of the policy that he had also authorized and announced. I respect enormously his willingness to take personal responsibility for a failure. Nevertheless, in doing something that Fidel didn't do, he also was signaling to Cubans the impotence of this new president, the inability of the person at the top of the government to have his own government follow his own decisions. The Party Congress. I urge you at moments where you may have trouble falling asleep to read not the lineamientos, but what came out of the Party Congress. They're not the same. They're not the same. So, lineamiento number 23 said that enterprises would set their own prices and could change their own prices. Could raise them, they could lower them. That lineamiento was cut. It never made it out of the Party Congress. Lineamiento number 27 said that cooperatives could sell directly to customers. What came out of the Party Congress inserted a phrase that said that cooperatives could sell to customers only after they had met all the obligations to sell to state agencies as set by the state agencies. That's very different from cooperatives can sell to their customers. And what comes out of the Party Congress inserted a second change, not in the lineamientos, which is that cooperatives could do this, but not through intermediaries. Merchants remain a disapproved profession. Lineamiento number 66 on international economics. It cut all reference to decentralizing decisions down to the level of the firm. Decisions with regard to exports and international economic transactions would remain centralized in the government agency. And on and on. What I want to